Thanks for having me. So hopefully everyone can hear me. Yeah. Okay, perfect. It's really nice to be here this morning. We're in the middle of a snowstorm, so very unlike mid-May conditions here in northern British Columbia, but it's great to be sharing some of our new research with you, as well as kind of giving a background on wildfire in British Columbia and some future directions where we can go. I kind of just jump right into it. So I have worked in fire suppression for a long time. I've always been interested in wildfire. I grew up in northern British Columbia, so in Smithers, which is right near the Alaskan Panhandle. And I lived on a small farm when growing up. And my parents really introduced me to beneficial relationships with fire. So we burned our fields every spring, and it was a really good learning experience for me. Understanding that fire is a healthy component of ecosystems. And then, entering into the world of wildfire. So working on a BC initial attack crew. And I started to kind of wonder about why we make decisions with wildfire. So why we let some fires go, why we suppress others, and kind of understanding how we value the broader land base. So what makes us decide to engage in fire exclusion or fire suppression. And so this kind of really sparked my interest in fire ecology. I have my PhD in fire ecology, and now I'm kind of getting back into the realm of applying fire to the broader land base. So this was on the right, a picture of myself. I'm an ignition specialist in burn boss and training, and it's on a fire in Kimberley just last week. So I'm really, really focused on supporting the application of controlled fire, be that prescribed fire or Indigenous fire stewardship, to British Columbia and throughout Canada. So after studying fire ecology for many years, my perspective and understanding of climate-induced wildfire disturbances, it really changed in a major way. All it took was one very windy December evening in Ventura, California, where I was living, and I kept thinking, wow, it sure is windy. Those Santa Ana winds are just blowing like crazy, but it's almost Christmas. So there's no way we could have a fire. There's no way. But then again, it's so dry, like what was really going on? We were in, 10 plus years of drought in California. And so when a fire ignited 30 miles away, I thought, okay, there's a fire 30 miles away, but it's not going to be affecting the city that I live in. And sure enough, 2 hours later, half of the city of Ventura was burning. This was the fastest moving wildfire on record, burning about an acre per second. And when we evacuated, we only had 5 minutes to leave. And so these kinds of events, you really carry them with you. You have a lot of stress related to fleeing a wildfire. You have a lot of emotional burden with kind of understanding this side of wildfire. And so this experience for me, it was not just evacuating for 24 hours. We were evacuated for 6 weeks. Our home was unlivable. And so I think it's really important to kind of understand this other side of wildfire. You can research it, you can understand the benefits of fire, but also to understand that fire is, a devastating and very frightening event. And so this definitely prompted my move back to Canada, where I naively kind of thought I was returning to this safer, more fire-resistant environment. And then 2018 happened, 2017 happened, 2021 happened, and I probably don't need to tell you because, if you were anywhere in Canada, you would have heard about these 3 very impactful wildfire seasons. So, this was across much of Western North America. We've seen really serious wildfire events where these aren't just large wildfires, they're impactful. So we're seeing lives being lost, homes destroyed, and definitely an increase in evacuations and area burned. So much of my research is focused on British Columbia, and I'm going to share a little bit about my research in subboreal and montane forests in northern BC. So British Columbia is still a province with fairly aggressive fire suppression and exclusion policies. It's really beginning to change, and I want to stress that we are moving towards more modified response, and we are starting to re-engage in fire and controlled fire. But for about 100 years, and this is the big point here, is we've been really good at putting out fires. We have been successful at, getting to lightning ignited fires very quickly. We have banned cultural burning. We've been so successful, we've created this wildfire deficit disorder where we have large accumulations of dead and dense fuel. And so this has created a lot of the problems that we are experiencing today. So in general, although the number of ignitions has steadily decreased, the annual area burned has increased. And so we're getting larger fires. And so the amount of forest burn in 2017, 2018, and 2021 is about equivalent to losing all of Vancouver Island. So these are not small areas. These are very, very large wildfire events, many of them complexes, so fires that come and burn together, and impacting just very large areas of land. And it's not just that fires are increasing in area burned, we're really seeing off the charts in extremes. So some of these fires exceeding 500,000 hectares, just a single fire event. And so, we're seeing extreme winds, temperatures below normal precip. We're seeing a lot of change in how fires burn during the night. There's very few nighttime recoveries, and we're also seeing fire creating their own weather system. And so the scale and impacts of forest we're losing is very significant, but it's significant also in a historical context. So in the past, we didn't see as large fires, or if we did, they weren't coming as often. So these wildfires are disproportionately impacting Indigenous peoples, for sure, living in remote and forested communities. A lot of these communities don't have, community volunteer fire departments, don't have basic infrastructure or capacity to deal with wildfires. And yet, I just want to really point out many communities have technical and place-based experience to engage in both prescribed and cultural fire. So, as we move towards a different relationship with fire, it's really important to know that there is many, many communities with very deep expertise in understanding wildfire, but also understanding the benefits of fire and applying fire. So that's really, really key, that Indigenous fire practitioners really hold important knowledge, as well as, guide outfitters, wildlife biologists, rangers. There's a lot of different expertise that exists. And so kind of in the background is this: in British Columbia, we have all these big wildfire seasons happening. And you can see that the general trend in applied prescribed fire is going down. So very few prescribed fires have been completed in the last 5 years. So this is just in British Columbia. It's not including cultural burning. It's looking at wildlife habitat burning. So silviculture, which is broadcast burning on cut blocks to increase plantation success, and then burning on federal lands. And so, the state of Florida burns more each year than all of Canada. So to put this in perspective, I don't think have burned even 5,000 hectares in 2021. So it is really, we have a long way to go. We're starting, but we need to be starting to think about applying a lot more fire to the land base. And at the end of the day, we are in this new era of wildfire. It's not coming. We're in it. We are experiencing wildfires that are, a combination of rapidly changing climate, 100 years of fuel accumulation. We are getting into the unsuppressible and uncontrollable wildfire events where, you can't just throw water on it. You can't just bring in more air tankers. It doesn't really work like that. Some of these fires will grow and be into that unsuppressible realm. We are seeing changing fire weather. And, very sadly, we're seeing communities that have been destroyed, direct fatalities, thousands of people evacuated. And of course, there's a lot of growing concerns about smoke, about wildfire fighter health, and about some of the long, post-traumatic stress disorder that comes from evacuating. So I think that kind of shifting into my research is I really see the need to bring in interdisciplinary research, the ability to understand both biophysical and social aspects of fire, health aspects of fire. And for myself, I rely on many different methods to understand fire. So I use a lot of tree rings. I'm a dendroecologist. I use a lot of forestry practices. I rely on history, so understanding what landscapes used to be and look like in the past. So I use repeat photographs. I'm very happy when I'm out in the field and learning about all different types of fire from many different teachers. And another key component of this is to have collaborative research. It is so key for moving forward. So I've been very fortunate to work closely and learn from knowledge holders, so that be that Indigenous fire practitioners or government agencies, so BC Wildfire with a lot of on-the-ground experience, community partners and federal agencies. And for me, I'm really passionate about linking knowledge to action. So I really believe in science communication and supporting other worldviews. I am a white settler. I've been in a privileged position to learn about fire ecology. I have been very fortunate to have been, brought up on Wet'suwet'en lands and have many of those teachings shared with me. But I've also want to, recognize that I, have overcome a lot of hurdles as a woman in fire to be in my current position. So I really believe that underrepresented voices bring diverse perspectives to applying fire, and they also bring innovative solutions to tackling some of the big wildfire problems in Canada. Part of understanding different types of fire and, the application of fire is supporting Indigenous-led fire stewardship. So for many people, there's a kind of a lack of understanding of what Indigenous fire stewardship is, but it's critical to having a better future with fire. And importantly, it's really specific to nations and to the many communities that comprise a nation. So here where I live in Northern British Columbia, I live next to a community that in the past had a diet of caribou. And so caribou really likes old growth forests. It loves reindeer lichen to eat. And so, they applied fire in a very different way from the community down the road that, primarily hunted moose. And so moose rely on that early successional forest. So even though, they're part of the same nation, they're neighbors, they have very distinct fire practices. That fire knowledge belongs to that community. It can't be copied or taken from the nation. It's really community focused and it's intergenerational, and it's used for many different reasons and values, and many that are outside of the realm of Western perspective understanding of fire. So prescribed burning is very distinct from cultural burning in who does it, where it's done, and for what reason. So prescribed burning is often a wildfire mitigation tool. It's used for restoration, and it's applied under specific parameters. So it's often is applied in a prescription with, certain humidities, winds, temperatures that it can be, controlled under. But it is similar to cultural burning in that it's conducted under these low risk conditions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the barriers and opportunities for Indigenous-led fire stewardship in Canada. So this is a paper that was published just last month, and it brings together many different perspectives from Indigenous fire practitioners, from government agencies, nonprofits, from fire scientists, and as well as experiences in many different nations across Canada. And this is co-led with Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen. And the goal of this paper was really to describe the barriers, but also opportunities. And so we really recognized and brought forward that generally there is a lack of understanding of what Indigenous fire stewardship is. There's a lack of respect for other ways of understanding fire, of living with fire, of using fire. And so most people, the general public, don't understand that Indigenous people have used fire as a tool for resource management for thousands of years, but it's still illegal to burn across broader Indigenous territories without a permit. There's also a lack of understanding of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and fire and how it supports the subsistence lifestyle, but is also a component of ceremony, of overall ecosystem health and community health. So it is used for sure to decrease the instances of wildfire coming into communities, but it's always used for multiple purposes and multiple reasons. And so in Western society, we often have this mistrust of fire. We haven't been brought up understanding it. We haven't experienced it in a good way. And so when we do experience wildfire, it's often on the news and it's very frightening. It's this natural disaster. And we often don't bring in the human component of it, how we can control it, but also how we can create the conditions to have these very, very disastrous wildfire events. So there's a lot of issues as well with how agencies are working and engaging with fire practitioners. And so there's a lot of training required to understand that there's major power imbalances. There's major issues over accreditation of experience and knowledge. And so some of the burns, the cultural burns I've been out on when agency personnel have come out, there's just kind of a disconnect in how fire is applied. So agencies come out, in personal protective equipment, and that is, required of them, but heavy machinery is there, big holding lines. And then, children come out with their grandparents and they're lighting a fire and they're wearing flip-flops. They're starting a burn with their elders, with their parents. And there is just a very big disconnect in understanding why fire is applied, for what reason, and even how to do it. So I've also been at burns where everyone's ready to go, and then suddenly the conditions change, and fire practitioners will say, well, no, this is not the right conditions to burn. It's not the right conditions for burning mushrooms, or it's not the right conditions for burning huckleberry patches. And so understanding fire that's right for the values is really, really key. Wildfire risk reduction is an important component of fire stewardship, but there's so many values that fall outside of fire suppression perspectives, and many reasons for burning that are not included in our understanding of fire. So often flooding is thought of as a really disastrous, direct impact of fire. So flooding comes after fire. But what if you could use fire to decrease instances of flooding? So those are some of the practices that go on in many of our Indigenous communities. So there's also a fear of smoke, when we're starting to try and get more controlled fire on the land base. So smoke has become a major issue. And when we have these wildfire events, we're not just, breathing in like a campfire, we are breathing in, material from the wildland urban interface. So treated wood, garbage, a lot of different things. And so it's really important to communicate that when cultural fire or prescribed burns are happening, these aren't producing a ton of smoke. They're not consuming a lot of fuel, and they're not taking place in the hot summer months, when it's 30 degrees. They're done under good venting conditions, often when there's snow still on the ground. And so there's this huge void in science communication describing the benefits of fire. And as a society, many of us have lost kind of touch with fire and our once close relationship with fire. And in the last year or so, much of North America is really rushing to engage in good fire. Like, let's get good fire on the land base. We've got this answer. We know what to do now. But in many places, we've overstepped. So we've undervalued continuously that deep technical and place-based expertise that exists in communities and in the fire practitioners that understand so many different ways to use fire and live with fire. So time after time, burn permits have been denied. And so there's a lot of frustration when then communities are lost to wildfire events that were not proactively managed. But change is also coming. And there's definitely a conversation that started about the benefits of cultural burning, but really specifically Indigenous-led fire stewardship. So, understanding that fire needs to be put on the broader land base. Fire doesn't just occur seasonally. Fire is something that is always part of, of our everyday lives. It's a tool for resource management. It keeps forests healthy. It increases biodiversity. And really importantly, it's based on the knowledge of the land and the people it belongs to. And so this is kind of an understanding of a fire calendar, that there is a lot of different components of burning, and that, lightning ignitions, natural lightning ignitions are still part of that Indigenous fire stewardship. So lightning does a lot of the work for you. And so understanding that all these different things are working together in this broader understanding of fire. So I'm going to, now that I've given you a little bit of background on fire in British Columbia, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of my dendroecological work reconstructing historic fire activity in Tweedsmuir Provincial Park. So I'm just going to start this. This kind of gives you an understanding of the amount of fire that's impacted northern British Columbia over the last roughly 100 years. So this is work that I'm completing in collaboration with BC Parks and the Chishlada Carrier Nation. So we're working in Tweedsmuir Park to reconstruct the first fire history there and understand the role of cultural burning in the past. So I'm just going to play that again so you can see. Tweedsmuir Park is just over 1 million hectares. It's the largest park in British Columbia. And in the last 5 years, it's lost about half of its forested area to wildfire, so about 500,000 hectares. And kind of unsurprisingly, maybe a lot of people are saying, well, that's just the status quo. That's where big fires happen. The largest fires outside of the boreal are in the subboreal. We would expect to have these stand replacing fires. But is that normal? Do we really understand the historic fire regime? And so conducting these fire histories in these really understudied areas helps us understand how to manage fire on the landscape. What is the historic fire regime? Has there been big departures from it? As well as, how do we capture kind of what those kind of last remaining old growth trees are telling us about the past. And so in 2018 and 2021, unfortunately, there was not enough resources during those really extreme wildfire seasons to suppress fire in the park. It was definitely not the time for modified response because we had very extreme fire weather. We had a ton of fuels to burn. And so this is an instance where fire suppression, is required if we want to protect major conservation and cultural values. So unfortunately, without having that support, we lost a lot of endangered species, a lot of culturally important values. Some of the last remaining ungulate winter range, 800-year-old whitebark pine trees. And this really highlights the issue with protecting habitat, old growth values, old growth management areas, but not engaging in proactive fire management. So in places like British Columbia, protected areas are really at risk for wildfires, and they will be destroyed by future fire. It's pretty much inevitable if we don't clean up these forests, if we don't manage them with wildfire, because you can have old growth forests and low severity fire, but you just need to be actively managing them. So outside of these really big fire perimeters, we were able to sample culturally modified whitebark pine trees. So these trees are examples of a kindling tree is a tree used when it's really wet to take kindling off to start fires. Trail marking trees or blaze trees really describe routes such as the grease trail, and bark strip trees. These can be peeled off and used to hold water. So many of these trees are over 500 years old, and they're really just telling the story about how fire was evident everywhere. Fire is a really important cultural management and resource management tool. So we were able to sample 65 fire-scarred whitebark pine trees and reconstruct about 25 fire events over the last 300 years. So right in 1937, which is that kind of pink box, that's when the park's established, and we see a major decline in fire events. There's only two lightning ignitions in our study area. One's in 1953 and 1957 after that park was established, and then that's it. So failing to include and understand cultural legacies of fire has really reinforced the notion that fire is rare, that it's severe, and that it's standard placing. And so when in fact, these wildfires appear to be artifacts of fire suppression. So we see a lot of evidence of repeat fires. And when we look closer across that cultural landscape, late season fire scars associated with burning for berries to increase fodder for game, they're very common. And some of these places have fire-scarred trees that burned 12 times. So these trees were not killed by fire. They are actually killed by whitebark or by mountain pine beetle. And these fires were often low severity, and so happening every 5 to 10 years. And so this fire history really much more closely resembles a dry ponderosa pine or grassland dominated ecosystem, and not a forest with an expected fire return interval of 100 to 300 years. So when we look at those natural disturbance types and how those are mapped out, those really are not including the history of cultural burning and Indigenous fire stewardship. And many histories have been erased. So this was actually yesterday. We were out in Tweedsmuir, and we just got back last night, fortunately, before the big snow came. But we were there because much of Tweedsmuir was flooded when the Nechako Reservoir was constructed in 1952. Many of these valley bottoms were not logged beforehand, and so these trees were left in the lake. And right now the lake is at very, very low levels, so we were able to go out and sample many of these trees that will be underwater next week. But evident in all of these trees in the valley bottom are many, many different fire scars, and many of them growing on habitation sites. And so with a lot of these fire scars, we see that there's really culturally important plants growing up in the area above them, a lot of aspen dominated stands. And so kind of reconstructing this landscape is really, really key. And, realizing that many of these things will be erased, but there's still evidence to find. So where do we go from here? We have, a pretty serious wildfire situation in British Columbia. But again, partner with that, we have a lot of opportunities for re-engaging with fire, for, having a different relationship with fire. And so what do we need to do? Well, we have about 100-year backlog of fuels that we need to clean up. And that's not just in British Columbia, that's in Canada, it's in North America. And, ultimately realizing that fire suppression as we know it has failed. We need to get to work. We need to engage in modified response. We need more controlled fire on the land base. And we need to kind of prepare for the inevitable, which is increasingly severe wildfire events. There's major issues with waste wood, what to do with it, with fuel accumulation, how to account for carbon, how to deal with these forests, and engage in fuel reduction at a staggering scale. And I think in order to do that, we really need collaborative and innovative research. And so another thing we need to start doing is educating children about fire as a healthy component of functioning ecosystems, as critical to biodiversity, as an important cultural practice. So we have a new paper that'll be coming out very soon, and it's aimed at children aged 8 to 12, and also reviewed by children ages in that age realm, to learn about the relationship between cultural burning and biodiversity, and why fire is so good for our forests, for our grasslands, for our animals. And so these are critical, important, knowledge translation pieces for moving forward. So changing the fire narrative and starting with school curriculum can really, really help build a society that's more accepting of fire. And understanding that the majority of fire workers are white, they're male, and they're agency-based. So there's very few women and underrepresented voices, minorities, and having different identities occupying those leadership roles in fire science and management. And so this has created a self-perpetuating culture that excels at rapid response and fire suppression, but is less effective at addressing emerging challenges and proactive solutions. But we really can take steps to make sure that fire is more welcoming and supportive. And of course, listening to other ways of viewing fire, of understanding fire, and different experiences is key to studying and managing fire. So less than 10% of fire agency positions are filled by women, and the proportion of women and underrepresented groups in those leadership roles is still even smaller. And the one thing I really realized is the importance of boundary spanners in all fields, but especially in fire extension. So fire is still incredibly controversial, and we need to take well-established science and make sure that we're translating that to the public and to policymakers, and using it to support the application of fire. And so boundary spanners are fairly rare, and they're really underutilized in fire, but they can play a really significant role in tackling environmental problems. So they can, straddle the divide between science and policy, scientists and non-scientists, and they can really promote innovation. So the reason that I've included all these images is that there's very strong scientific support for the effectiveness of fuel mitigation, the application of controlled fire, but we still really rely heavily on fire suppression. Don't get me wrong, fire suppression is not going anywhere. We're still really going to need it to protect the values that we care about. But really importantly, even though fire suppression is more expensive and supports less jobs, we're stuck on this kind of fire suppression trap. Understanding that fuel mitigation will support many different jobs. Applying fire, proactive fire, will be less expensive. So, it only costs about $200 an acre to use controlled fire, costs about $800 an acre to suppress a fire. So the math is in, the science is in, the economics are in. So what's kind of holding us back? I think the times that we've known when it's time to burn are changing. So for example, this spring, the time to burn was actually in March. So they're coming earlier. We need to really understand how the land is telling us that it might be time to burn. We need to incorporate other research along with an improved understanding of what a successful burn is. And so understanding how often we need to burn. What do we need to do? Do we need to do fuel mitigation before we burn? Do we need to plant things? Do we need to, how do we prepare these forests for controlled fire or to prepare them for a coming wildfire? Understanding what we're monitoring for. Do we need to burn in the spring or the fall? Do we need to change what we're doing? What does success mean? These are all important components of applying fire, of engaging in future fire. And so, what does success mean? Does it mean that the deer came back to eat the fresh grass? Or does it mean there's a new firekeeper in a community? So much of the fire prescriptions that exist are within the frame of fire suppression. So cultural fire prescriptions, or these alternative fire prescriptions for ranchers and guide outfitters, they don't always align with fire suppression values and definitions of success. And so, a rancher might want to know, did this invasive species get killed? What kind of things do we need to do to control for that? These are all very important questions, and they're critical to our understanding. And the planning phase really needs to incorporate these. And the monitoring phase really needs to have a different timestamp on it. So not just burned in black, oh, success, but understanding, did that fire maybe help salmon come back the river? There's all sorts of different things that we need to incorporate. So unfortunately, the narrative of fire has been shaped by very frightening wildfire events. So if you looked at dominant news headlines in British Columbia coming out in 2021, this is what you saw. And it's scary. What if this was the only version of fire you saw? Or what if you had a future of fire that read like this? So these were also headlines coming out in 2021. And, this is kind of the new fire reality coming. And it's very exciting. And there's a lot of opportunity. And so I'll kind of leave you here with this. And I'm happy to take any questions. And I just want to say thank you to the many amazing teachers and mentors that have helped me get to where I am today, and also my amazing co-authors and funders. And just wanted to say that I'm happy to answer questions, but you're also welcome to reach out to me via email if you want to chat further.